Recording this meeting, just so you know. We have it set up so hopefully only those of us who are presenting will be recorded. So please, just for you to be aware. And yeah, let us know where you're joining us from around the world. We've got a poll here. You can let us know where you're joining us from. We'll show the results just before we get started. And in the chat, if you'd like to just let us know what it is you're excited about or what you're interested in for today's topic. We're super, super excited to have all of you here and have our guests. So thank you. And if you've just joined us, please feel free to fill out the poll. We'll share the results pretty soon. So nice to see so many people. I see we've got a couple of responses coming in here. And yes, again, in the chat, if you'd like to let us know what it is you're most interested in or excited for today's webinar, love to hear. Love to hear from you. So let's see here. Give it another minute or so. Thanks, Karen. Thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, I'm excited to listen and learn as well. I think it's going to be an interesting talk. Let's see here. Okay. Maybe. So. Yeah, if you haven't, let's see here. If you haven't already responded to the poll, please do so. If you're not seeing it, let me see if I can reshare that once more. Go. There we go. Now we're seeing a good representation from North America, East Asia, and Pacific. And for East Asia and Pacific, it is probably quite early or late, depending on how you look at it, wherever you are. So we really appreciate you being here with us. All right. And yeah, Kasia, thank you. I think in some ways identify as a global nomad, and in other ways, I'm still learning what that might even mean. So I'm excited to hear Asuka and Phoebe's take on this. All right, so I think I will share these poll results. You can see a little bit of where your fellow attendees are joining us from. Might start getting started here soon. Just checking the time. Yeah, oh, here we go. Got a couple more folks coming in. And if you're just joining us, welcome again. Let us know in the chat where it is you're joining. Let us know what you're most interested in about today's topic. Yeah, thank you all for being here. So I might get started now. My name is Samantha Corpus. I'm with the Laurasian Institution based in Seattle, Washington. Joining me is Gabriel Riebeck. And Gabe, if you could wave if you'd like to say hello as well.
Hello, everybody. My name is Gabriel Riebeck, Japan Programs Manager in the Laurasian Seattle office. I just wanted to say I'm going to be kind of working in the background of this one a little bit and doing the questions and answers, kind of getting that ready to go over here. So that's why my name is Q&A Submissions. But I just wanted to say personally that I'm very proud of this Laurasian Institution Presents event series, and I'm super honored that the hosts of Culture Crossings have decided to join us to have a little chat with us today. So really looking forward to listening to the content. Hello, nice to see everybody.
Yeah, so if you do have questions, please submit them as a direct message to Q&A submissions. Gabe will have them, and then we'll be able to address them during the Q&A portion towards the end of today's webinar. Just a couple housekeeping items before I do a little bit of an introduction for Laurasian here. As you can probably see on your screen, that this webinar is being recorded. We are we have it set up so hopefully only the speakers will be recorded. But if you are uncomfortable, please keep your videos off. That is totally fine by us. We also, excuse me, we'll hope to answer all of your questions during the Q&A portion. Unfortunately, there might not be so much time during the presentations today to do that. So and that being said, maybe we'll dive into a brief introduction about Laurasian Institution. We are a nonprofit educational organization focused on academic and cultural exchange. Our programs have spanned the past 30 years and have been sponsored by both the US State Department and the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so primarily our focus of engagement and interaction is in the US-Japan context. We have several programs that we are very proud of, some of which have been long-standing and you know, continue to evolve. We're very excited for the quality of the programs that we are able to provide. First of which is the Japan Outreach Initiative, or JOY program, which brings cultural coordinators from Japan to higher education institutions and nonprofits throughout the US South, Midwest, and mountain regions, doing cultural outreach and engagement in their local communities. Our next program is the Japanese Language Education Assistance Program, or JLEAP. And this one, similarly to JOY, dispatches Japanese young professionals and teachers to US K-12 schools, teaching language and working in team teaching environments with their host school's lead teacher of Japanese. Kind of similar to the JET program, but in reverse, if anyone is familiar with the JET program. Our next program, New Perspectives Japan, or NPJ, is a 2-week-long study abroad program in the summer for middle and high school students. They spend a few days doing cultural and sightseeing activities in Kyoto and Tokyo, but the main portion of the trip is spent during a week-long homestay in a Japanese home and attending Japanese school. We attach curricula to these programs as well. And it's quite a robust and very meaningful, I think, exchange, not just a trip to Japan, as great as that is. And finally, we have been involved with the Tomodachi Initiative, specifically with SoftBank, Johnson & Johnson, and Honda for the past several years, doing outreach and exchange between Japan and the US through this public-private partnership between these organizations, the US-Japan Council, the Japan Foundation, and ourselves. And yeah, if you would love to know more about us, here's a little bit of our contact information. We'll share that in the chat later on as well. And now, without further ado, I would love to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. So Asuka Ichikawa is a prospective PhD student and in international and higher education. Her research interests include mobility, identity, and well-being of international students. Prior to this, she worked for private and public institutions in Japan and the US, including the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership based in New York. And joining her is Phoebe A. Lee. She is a Filipino Chinese Canadian who has navigated cross-cultural environments her whole life. She has a background in journalism and is currently working in business development and administration while continuously developing her creative muscles through writing and content creation. Thank you both for joining us today. After Asuka and Phoebe's presentation, like I said, there will be some time for Q&A. Following that, we will have a door prize drawing featuring Kasia of Ikigai Connections. She has 5 free video tutorials, I believe, that usually would have to pay for professional development services. Kasia, I'll have you introduce yourself maybe towards the end there as well. But if you want to give a little wave so that everyone can see you. And you can learn more about Ikigai Connections at the QR code on her background there. So we'll have the drawing for the 5 door prize winners at the end. And then following that, we will actually close recording or stop recording. And we'll have about 10 minutes for just kind of free conversation and discussion without the sort of pressure of being filmed. So I hope you'll stick around for this event. And now I would love to turn this over to Asuka and Phoebe. So Asuka, if you would like to start us off. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Thank you so much, Samantha and Gabe, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on a weekend. My name is Asuka from Culture Crossings. And I used to work for the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership in New York. And that's how I got to know the amazing team at the Laurasian Institution. And so I just wanted to take this moment to thank you so much for keeping in touch. And we're so grateful to have an amazing webinar series like this. All right, with that, Phoebe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'll quickly introduce myself as well. And I want to thank the Laurasian Institute as well for inviting us. This is such a great opportunity for us. Yes, so my name is Phoebe. I'm Asuka's co-host for Culture Crossings. And as Samantha mentioned before, I have a background in journalism, and currently I'm working in business development and administration at an architecture firm, and I do culture crossings and writing on the side.
All right, with that, we would like to start the webinar, but just before that, we want to share a couple of disclaimers from our end. So first, as much as we want to encourage interactions among everyone, please do note that this is being recorded. But that said, we wanted to create some safe space. So in the end, we'll pause the recording so that people can have some space to share some reflections, introduce yourselves, share some contact information if you'd like. So yes, that'll happen later. And second, Phoebe and I will be sharing some stories based on our own perspectives. So basically, please note that our thoughts are independent from the organizations or places we've worked before. So that was that. All right, with that, let's dive into our webinar. And at this point, I'd like to share my screen. Okay. I think because I'm a co-host, I'm seeing the pop-up saying who can share. And I'm just clicking only host. Sorry, my screen just kind of paused there. All right, I think I got it now. Can everybody see my screen all right? Awesome, okay, thank you so much. All right, so let's get this started. Whether you've lived abroad as an international student, an immigrant, or foreign-born professional, the time that you spend in another country can become part of who you are. So today, we'd like to explore what it really means to navigate between cultures and countries. And we would like to use our personal and professional experiences to talk about this. And this is our agenda for today. So we'll begin by introducing our podcast. We'll talk about what we exactly mean by living with a cross-cultural identity. Then we'll follow with my personal story, mostly focused on my professional experiences in Japan. And Phoebe will share her story. And then we'll move on to Q&A. And after some time, we'll move into unrecorded dialogue for reflections and connections. So I hope that sounds good for everyone. Okay, so Culture Crossings is a podcast for globally mobile millennials with cross-cultural identities. Phoebe and I are both co-hosts and co-producers, and we also have Jade, who's joining us today, who helps us with our social media. Phoebe and I met when we were undergraduate students at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And since then, we kept in touch and we founded our podcast in 2020. And that was when the pandemic happened. So thanks to technology, we did everything virtually. So Phoebe's right now based in Toronto and I'm in New York. but we were able to do this together. And we basically wanted to create the podcast because we wanted to share our reflections for having a globally mobile way of life. And we wanted to create a free audible resource for anyone who might be going through similar experiences. So in season 1, we explore topics such as culture shock, reverse culture shock, cross-cultural mental health. And we are now in season 2, where we do a series of interviews with professionals in various industries to talk about professional development for people who have cross-cultural identities. And here we go. At this point, some of you may be thinking what we exactly mean by cross-cultural identity. And to give some context, I would like to share some numbers. The United Nations defines migrants as people residing in a country other than their country of birth. As of 2019, there are 272 million international migrants around the world. This is 51 million more from 2010, and this accounts for about 3.5% of the whole global population. Regionally, Europe hosts the largest number of international migrants, followed by North America. And for the interest of the Laurasian institutions and some educators in our audience, I also put the number of international students, who are students who seek post-secondary education abroad. And as of today, there's over 5 million international students in the world, which is an increase of about 2 million back in 2000. Our podcast, we focus on the well-being of those who grew up multiculturally and multinationally. And this concept of growing up in more than one country is actually not new. And we often use the term third culture kids, or TCK. The term TCK was originally coined by an American sociologist, Dr. Ruth Hill Usim, in the 1950s. She initially defined first culture as the home country or the country of birth, second culture as the host country or where the family moved to, and then third culture as kind of a way of life that shapes their experiences in between. TCK was initially used to refer to children who grew up in a missionary or expat families, but today it can also be used for children who grew up in multinational environment, such as by having parents who went through international marriages or people who went to international schools. And some suggest the use of cross-culture kids to be more inclusive of children who have similar backgrounds, so you may hear both terms being used. TCKs tend to share some characteristics such as being multilingual, open-minded, and culturally aware. At the same time, because we tend to move around the world, some TCKs may feel home can be both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And that gives us the background to the community of people we introduce in our podcast. And what makes our podcast unique is that we talk further about the lives of TCKs who become adults. For example, usually international students are assumed to return to our home countries, and immigrants are assumed to uproot themselves and settle down in a new country. But in our podcast, we feature a community of people who keep moving internationally well into our adulthood. Of course, not all migrants continue this kind of lifestyle. And so I do acknowledge that some of it is a privilege to lead life like this. But we also think there are unique challenges and experiences that we navigate as cross-cultural young professionals. And so we hope some of our personal stories can be some food for thought if you are currently navigating this or plan to have a cross-cultural life. All right, so from here, I'd like to share my story. And here I will begin by sharing a bit about who I am. And then in relation to the Laurasian Institution's previous webinar on job search in Japan or in Japanese organizations, I'd like to share some experiences in working in Japan as a new graduate. And then I'll conclude with some suggestions for self-care and empowerment. Okay, so that is a timeline of my life so far. I was born in the city of Kawasaki in Japan, went to a local school until grade 6, and then went to an international school in Japan. I decided to study abroad when I was 16, and so that was the time I left my family to go to Canada. I finished my undergraduate degree there, where I met Phoebe, and came back to Japan for a master's degree. And I worked for an American investment bank as a new graduate in Japan. After about 3 years later, I decided to make a career change and came back to North America for a master's degree, worked for the Japan Foundation in New York, and after leaving the foundation, I founded Culture Crossings with Phoebe. And here I am now waiting to start my doctoral program in international education. Now, this may seem straightforward, like what you will see on a resume, but in real life, as some of you may relate, especially if you're moving from a country to another, things don't usually move along in a linear manner. So in my case, this is what my career path really looks like and feels like. So it's definitely not linear. I didn't intend this when I was drawing a line on the slide, but the line actually is pretty reflective of my emotional stages along the journey. So you can kind of see my ups and downs. Yes. Among main challenges in life, the hardest happened when I was an undergraduate student in Canada. Well, my father was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and that is why I went to Japan after graduation. And then from there, you can see my low point where I struggled with grief and reverse culture shock. Years later, I got married to my husband, who is also from Japan. At that time, he was doing his PhD in New York. So that is why I chose to find a job in New York. And I did find a job at an amazing organization, but I had to resign because of the postgraduate visa for an international student in the US pursuing humanities is actually good for 1 year. And so I could not renew it because I lost the lottery. It's an annual lottery system for H-1B visa application for the foreign-born professionals. And so after that, I decided to pursue my long-term goal to promote intercultural understanding, hopefully as a professor in the future at a university. So I applied and got accepted to a graduate school in the US. But then the pandemic happened. So my student visa approval was delayed for a year. And so I could not work during this time because if you are a spousal or if you are on a spousal visa of an international student in the US, you are actually not allowed to earn an income here. So my point is that while I definitely had some privileges to study and live abroad, I'm also living with constant job insecurity due to multiple identities that I carry with me. And so I'm really glad that Phoebe and I reconnected around this time because for me, Culture Crossings was really a way for me to kind of rebel against all these odds and promote intercultural understanding in ways I can. Okay. So with that, I like to talk about where I had my low point as a new graduate in Japan, not because I want to scare anyone away from working in Japan, but there were some lessons for me that helped me to become a bicultural professional. And as a disclaimer, I don't mean to make any generalizations about Japan or Japanese corporate culture, but I will use some literature and my personal experiences to talk about my corporate culture shock in Japan. And before I begin with my personal stories, I wanted to describe some context around working environment in Japan. And the two key terms here would be the respect for hierarchy and harmony. And I'll draw on the literature by Dr. Yar at Chuo University in Japan. First, as opposed to the Western countries that tends to value individualism, Japan's known to have a collectivist society that tends to prioritize groups' needs over the individual. In workplaces, new graduates or those who are starting their first career out of college are usually hired for their potential to grow in an organization rather than for their technical expertise. And in this respect, so being adaptable to the existing norms to sustain the harmony is an important trait. Now, in Japan, college students usually graduate in March, And so all new graduates start working from April. And in that month, most Japanese companies will hold what's called Shinsotsu Kenshu, or which means a training for new graduates. So in this kind of training, most people learn about business manners or fundamentals in workplaces to work as professionals in Japan. Now, my case was slightly different because I graduated from a program in the fall. So that meant I started working earlier than my fellow new graduates. I actually began working in February. So this was before me having an opportunity to go through a training. I eventually did go through a training, but when I started, there were many unwritten rules and expectations that I was not ready for. Now, I understand that some of you may not have to go through what I went through because maybe you are already familiar with the Japanese corporate culture, or perhaps you may not look Japanese, so people not expect you to know or follow some of the norms. But I hope that some of my stories could be a resource for new graduates with international backgrounds or those in managerial roles who might want to rethink about the culture at your workplace to be more inclusive and transparent for people with cross-cultural backgrounds. And I will go through all these experiences using 3 examples. All right, so the first one is asking questions. And you might be thinking, what could go wrong? Isn't it just asking a question? And to that, I'd say, actually, yes, it can. So here I'm showing an image of a trading floor at an investment bank. My role was not a trader. So my team worked with fewer number of screens in the operations, but you basically get the idea how tense the environment was. When I joined, one of my managers explained to me how to do a task, and she told me that I could get back to her if I had any questions. I went to my desk, worked on the task, and went up to her later, eager to ask questions, because asking questions was a way for me to survive in new places. And being an active learner was a good thing, at least during my time in Canada. My manager kindly answered my questions, and I thought I'm starting to build a good enthusiasm in the team as a new graduate. But then later, my senior colleague told me what on earth I'm doing, and she told me that I should not be asking questions to my manager. I was confused. But it turned out that there is a hierarchy in the order of which you can ask questions to. So rather than going directly to my manager, supposedly I had to ask my senior colleague first, who was in between my rank and the manager, because it meant that my senior colleague, who was supposed to be mentoring a new graduate, was perhaps not able to answer my question or was not being attentive enough. So without intending, I had caused my senior colleague a trouble or disrespect without intending. So over time, I learned how skipping someone along the hierarchy can cause unintended consequences. Also, I learned that my colleagues tend to withhold questions or ask for support, partly because they don't want to bother others who are already super busy, but also because they didn't want to be seen as incompetent. So that was my experience as a new graduate. But if you happen to be in a managerial position and want to facilitate a conversation or communication in a team, it might be a good idea to speak with each person in a team to see what hierarchy means for each person and how you could remove a sense of shame in asking questions or when they want to reach out for help or support when in need. Okay. The next example is where to sit at a meeting. When I joined the firm, I used to think all the seats are essentially the same, except for maybe the manager's spot at the table. So one day I sat in a random seat during a meeting, and at some point, someone's desk phone rang in the office. Well, I knew it was ringing, but I tried to keep my focus in a meeting because I thought it's rude to leave the meeting. But later, my assigned mentor told me that as a new graduate, I should have first of all sat at the seat closest to the door and immediately leave the room to get the phone. And to give some context, since we worked as a team, we had a shared group line, and we could also answer anyone's phone on behalf. And not only had to, be the first one to get the phone, because we were in the client-facing team with institutional clients, we usually had to get the phone in 3 rings at the latest. So usually people grab the phone in the first ring. So I later learned in the new graduate training that there are seating plans, as shown in the picture on the left. From 1 to 5, it shows kamiza to shimoza, referring to the most high-ranking seat to the lowest, which is by the door. And because I was a new graduate, there was this consistent silent expectations among members in my team that I should be at the door at every meeting. And so no new graduate joined my team during the time that I was at the investment bank. So for almost 3 years, I sat by the door every meeting and booked right out when the phone rang. And so some people may have, fancy images of people working at investment banks. Some of it may be true, but in my case, I wore flats every day because I had to be ready to just go to the phone when I needed. Yeah, so thinking back among many things, I think it was this hierarchical nature of the workforce that really drained me mentally, because I haven't experienced it in such a degree before. In a way, I had to be alert and demonstrate my place in the team's hierarchy. Example 3. The third example is about timing to go home after work. And this is a picture of a TV drama by TBS in 2019. And the title, Watashi teiji de kaerimasu, literally translates to I go home on time, meaning she will not stay to do overtime work. Now, this may sound natural in a Western context because you should go home if you're done with your work. But this drama is kind of sensational and interesting in Japanese context because in a way, it is a statement about how toxic the current workaholic culture in Japan can be. There is a lingering tendency in Japan where long hours and hard work are somewhat romanticized and also expected to show loyalty to the firm or to your boss. And these things can matter because it could subjectively impact your reputation and evaluation at the company. While I was at the company, there was a campaign for the managers to go home first so that their staff could also go home without feeling guilty. Now, the intention was probably right, but then in reality, many staff stayed in the office because someone had to finish the work that was left undone. So if you are a new graduate, you might have to navigate a little bit to see how to make healthy boundaries with your colleagues. But in the end, the company won't really look after you if you get sick. And so it's really important to prioritize your health. And if you happen to be in a managerial role, it might be helpful to check in with each person to see what's preventing the person to go home on time and reach out for support from your end. Some people may think that's too much hand-holding and some people may not need one. But if your staff are consistently staying over time, it might be actually a good opportunity to start a conversation to resolve any misunderstanding or take some small steps. And finally, when I was struggling through these corporate cultural norms in Japan, I used to go to bookstores a lot. And I realized that Japanese people who grew up in Japan may be actually struggling with similar things. So for example, the titles of these books from the left to right translate to The Courage to be Disliked, the textbook for first years in the company, and How to Say What's Difficult to Bring Up in a Conversation in a mindful way. So the challenges of Japanese employees who grew up in Japan may not be exactly the same as what we navigate as cross-cultural individuals. But seeing all these books, it was a kind of a relief for me to know that, okay, I'm actually not alone in this. Now, those were some of the examples of my lessons learned as a new graduate in Japan. And my experiences were actually from the American firm in Tokyo. So you could kind of see how some Western firms could adapt the local culture and in this case, kind of Japanize to some extent. And the stories I shared were mostly about my challenges, but I'm glad that I actually had the opportunity to work with great colleagues around the world through this organization. And I did learn to become a culturally sensitive professional. But I wanted to share these stories to encourage anyone thinking about working in Japan to really do some research to get to know the organizations you want to work for and think a lot about environment you can best thrive in. Because as this literature suggests, despite some calls for changes in long working hours and other things in Japanese corporate settings, it can take a long time for organizations and workplaces to change. So that is my message for the new graduates, to really have a sense of ownership in your career and think about where you can be happy as a person too. And to those in a managerial level working in Japanese firms or in similar contexts, I hope my stories can be some food for thought for you to think about how to make the workplace inclusive and transparent for people from diverse backgrounds. And I wanted to end with a slide on self-care and empowerment. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but here are some suggestions. At your workplace, I would encourage you to create a safe space in ways you can. For example, if your company has a one-on-one system with your manager, really use that time to build trust with your manager and have an open conversation. In my case, I had a Canadian manager who made it easier for me to communicate some of my cross-cultural struggles. But since he was a white male Canadian, he didn't experience these things in a way as I did. Sometimes it was a challenge for me to describe it to him, but I was really fortunate to have him as an understanding manager who understood my passion to work with people, and he really encouraged me to work on human resource related projects in the division. The next one would be to join clubs or groups to meet new people in the firm. In my case, I joined the Glee Club or the singing club at the firm. And not only was it a really good chance for me to meet with people outside of my team, because of practices, it also became a good excuse for me to leave work on time. And the last one might be actually challenging if you're new to the team, but I would really encourage you to practice how to negotiate the workload. Now, saying an outright no to your seniors may cause some issues, but perhaps you could think of other creative ways, for example, by visualizing your current workload for others to see. Because again, your well-being really matters and you really need to, make conscious time and space for that. Beyond your workplace, I would suggest you to keep ties and nurture that with your friends from places you've lived before, or venture out and in new spaces in your country, and find communities where you can speak in the language you want, or just talk about all these cross-cultural things that you want. And this may sound cliche, but your physical health is really important for you as well. So eat well, sleep well, and I hope you can exercise as well to clear your mind. And finally, don't hesitate to seek out professional help for your mental health. I know it can be a challenge to find bilingual therapy resources in Japan. So I've just listed one here. It's called Tell Japan, and it's a nonprofit organization. They offer free phone and text messaging services for counseling, and you can also book some appointments with professionals. So with that, thank you so much for listening to my story, and I'd like to switch it over to Phoebe to expand our context beyond Japan and US.
So thank you so much for that, Asuka. I loved hearing about your story, and hearing about your personal experiences definitely made me reflect more on my own experiences as well. So for my part, I'm going to be talking about growing up cross-culturally and about negotiating different identities in different cultural contexts. Okay, so at first when I wanted to speak about this topic, I wanted to speak about it more broadly, but then I realized that people who grew up in multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multicultural environments are all very unique, and it's kind of impossible to speak for all of them. So for this topic, I'm gonna use my own story as a sort of case study. So a little bit about me. I was born in Manila in the Philippines to ethnically Chinese parents. So I grew up culturally very Chinese as well as Filipino. And when I was about 13, my family and I immigrated to Vancouver, Canada. And that's where I stayed until I finished my undergraduate at the University of British Columbia, where I, of course, met Asuka. And after I graduated, I went back to Manila for about a year to spend more time with my dad because he was there at the time. And after that, I went back to Vancouver where I worked for a little bit. And at the same time, I was applying to graduate school. And so after that, I went to London in the UK where I did my master's in journalism. And I stayed there for a year and then I went back to Canada. And then I had a brief stint in Turkey because I had a friend who was a photojournalist and she was a freelance photographer in Istanbul at the time. And so I also wanted to kind of try it out. And so I was there for about less than a year. And then I went back to Canada. And this is now I'm in Toronto since 2019. And this is where I currently live and work. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about code switching because I'm gonna be mentioning it a lot later on. So I want to define code switching a little bit, and I took this definition from Oxford Bibliographies, and any resources I mention is linked to the last slide of this presentation. So for anybody who's curious to learn more, we can definitely send out all the resources that we've mentioned for this presentation. So to define code switching, it's using two or more codes of language varieties within an exchange. So this can happen not only between two different languages, but it can also happen between dialects, registers, or styles of language. And it originally arose from linguistics, but it has since expanded to other fields such as sociology and psychology. And so now broadly, we can also define the term as adjusting one style of speech, appearance, behavior, and expression in ways that will optimize the comfort of others in exchange for fair treatment, quality service, and employment opportunities. So I'd like to point you, oh, not yet, sorry, Asuka. So about this video that I'm gonna show you in a bit, this video is actually cited in a lot of articles that talk about code switching. So this video is of the former President Obama when he was at a basketball game. And it shows how he kind of acts differently when he greeted, the white coach versus the Black basketball players. And we can play the video now.
What's up, champ? What are y'all doing with this rookie, man?
You can stop it now. Yeah, so yeah, as you can see, although it was very subtle, if you don't pay attention, but he was kind of a little different in the way he interacted with the coach versus the players. And I think it's kind of a good thing to keep in mind as well, because, although someone may be code switching when they're interacting with you, you might not notice it, but behind that, it could really be a struggle for the person. Okay, so to provide a bit more context, I want to talk about the way I grew up in the Philippines. So in terms of my language adaptation, when I was first learning how to talk, my mom taught me English. And then because I was living in the Philippines, I naturally picked up the Filipino language, or Tagalog as it's called. And because my parents and my relatives spoke Chinese, I kind of picked it up as well. Specifically, my family speaks the Fujian dialect, which is from the Fujian province of China, which is located in southeastern China. And most Filipino Chinese people speak that dialect. And so I ended up just naturally mixing the three languages when I spoke to the people around me. And because everybody around me spoke the same way as I didn't think there was anything unusual about the way I spoke until I went to kindergarten. And that was the first time I realized that, some people might not understand me, because when I was kind of chatting to a classmate who was a Filipino, there were some words that she didn't understand, and she'd ask me, what does that mean? And I'd be confused because I'd be like, why don't you know what it means? And then she'd ask me, what language is that? And I'd be like, it's Filipino. And she'd be like, no, it's not. And I was like, okay, then English. And she was like, no, it's not English either. I was like, okay, then I don't know. And so after that, I go home and I asked my mom, what language I was speaking. And she was like, it's Chinese. And so I think that was really the first inkling of realization I had that not everybody may understand me, and that I was, kind of mixing my languages. And then another complication I had was that I went to a Chinese school. And what that was is basically it's a private school that teaches Chinese language and culture. And the reason we have Chinese schools in the Philippines is it's not a form of segregation or anything like that. It's just, a way for the Chinese community to really preserve our identity and culture. And anybody can enter the school as long as you meet the educational requirements. So, Filipinos and Chinese can go to a Chinese school. Although most people, I'd say probably 95% of the student population is ethnically Chinese. And so when I started going to school, we were taught Mandarin at school. And so then I would confuse my Mandarin with my Fujian dialect, and I would use them interchangeably. So at first I couldn't really tell the difference between them either. I basically thought the new words I was learning was synonymous with the Fujian words that I already knew, and I would use them interchangeably. And I wasn't the only one either, because a lot of my classmates did the same thing. Like if a teacher asked us a question, like some of us would answer back in Fujian. And the teachers didn't really correct us either, because they spoke Fujian as well. And I think they were just happy as long as we were speaking Chinese. But they would get mad if we answered in English or Filipino. But of course, this also changed as I got older, and I learned to differentiate between Mandarin and Fujian. Next slide. So in terms of the way I adapted to local cultures, I think it was a very natural process for me, just because there is sort of an established Filipino Chinese culture already. Of course, culture is always evolving, but since I was born there, and there has been a Chinese presence in the Philippines for a long time. The first Chinatown in the world is actually in Manila. And Chinese merchants have been going to the Philippines to trade since the 15th century, way before the Spanish or the Americans came. So, and that's why the Filipino Chinese culture naturally developed and evolved over time as a very distinct culture and identity from, say, mainland Chinese culture. And the Filipino Chinese culture has elements of Filipino and traditional Chinese culture mixed in together. And with that, I want to point you to the picture in the slide. And this picture is a picture of a crucifix in Chinatown in Manila. And this is actually a pretty famous landmark. It's at a very busy intersection in Chinatown. and people actually come here to pray. If you look closely at the picture, you're actually going to see the red incense sticks that people usually use in Buddhist temples and ceremonies and rituals. And so the way Chinatown people pray to the cross here is that they would light the incense sticks and then, bow to the cross. And, that's how they kind of honor and venerate the crucifix. And I think this is a really interesting example of how the Filipino Chinese culture evolved into its very own distinct culture. And so in terms of code switching, when I was living in Manila, I don't think I really committed any major faux pas when it came to etiquette, at least when I was there as a kid, because I lived there my whole life. So I naturally learned what was socially acceptable or not. And Filipino Chinese cultures have a certain similarity in the way they show their respect for their elders. So whenever I interacted with Filipino elders, I knew how to be polite and not talk over them and not ask too many questions, like Asuka mentioned before. So I don't think I really have a recollection of changing the way I acted when I was with different people when I was living there. But of course, in terms of language, I would, change the way I talked and the languages I used. And so I want to move on to the way I grew up in Canada. And so in terms of my language adaptation, when I grew up in Canada, so when I first came to Canada, I didn't really have that much trouble understanding people or communicating with people. But what I was really concerned about was my accent. And I remember just trying so hard to minimize my Filipino accent. I practiced every day at home by myself. I'd really pay attention and listen to the way that people spoke around me. And then I go home and practice reading out loud just to get myself used to Canadian English. Of course, now I don't really think it's that big of a deal. As long as you're able to communicate with people and they understand you and you understand them, I think that's really the function of language anyway. But back then, especially as a young adolescent and an immigrant, I just wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be the odd person in class, and I just wanted to be like everybody else. And so in terms of my cultural adaptation, I think on the surface back then, I could sort of find common ground to talk about with people around me, even as a newcomer to Canada and as a new kid in school, because I grew up on American pop culture. Because we spoke English in the Philippines, so we didn't really need subtitles when watching English speaking TV shows. And I read a lot of, English language novels as well. And so I grew up on MTV and Cartoon Network and Hollywood movies. So in terms of any pop culture references or just things that people would talk about in general, I get it because I had probably seen it on TV or read about it in books. But that's just the surface, right? Seeing something on screen and living it is very different. So one of the biggest differences for me is seeing the difference between how people treated authority figures. So for traditional Chinese culture, there's this real deference to authority. And I grew up that way at home and institutionalized at school. So my school was extra strict because not only was it a Chinese school, it was also an all-girls Catholic school run by nuns. For example, in the Philippines, you definitely can't call someone by their first name, whether you're Filipino or you're Chinese, just because, for your elders, it's, kind of rude if you call them by their first name. So you have to say, if they're older than you, then, brother or sister or auntie, uncle, grandpa, grandma, even if they're not your relatives, you have to say that. So everyone is like your relatives almost. If it's your boss, you call them ma'am or sir or Mr. something, Miss something. And so in Canada, I found it hard at first to call elders by just their first name. For example, with family friends or friends' parents, even if they say it's okay to call them by their first name, I'd still say, you know, Mr. or Mrs. something. Even in university, professors would say it's okay to call them by their first name, but I would always say professor or doctor. But when I entered the workforce, everyone was calling their bosses or managers by their first names. So of course I did the same thing. And I also didn't want to be the only person who would be calling our boss Mr. or Mrs. something, you know. And I remember my aunt, when she was new to Canada, she said she was also really uncomfortable calling her boss by just their name. So I think this is an important thing to consider because it could potentially affect the way you're perceived in the workplace. Because it's important to build rapport with your colleagues, including your managers, right? And so for people who are used to very hierarchical structures, they might not be as comfortable with, say, a more horizontal hierarchical structure. At least for me, I think sometimes it's still a struggle to find that middle ground of how can I build a good rapport with higher ups, but still keep that respect in place. I feel like for people who spend their entire lives in Canada, for example, they're much more comfortable towing that line of rapport and respect. Whereas for me, I feel like I tend to be more concerned about not making a mistake. So I feel like I take on a more defensive approach where I tend to stick to more neutral topics of conversation, whereas others might be more comfortable joking around with the managers and still not cross that line. Right. And so in terms of code switching, in terms of code switching now, I think I've also done it for so long that it's just autopilot. I don't even think about it anymore. And I don't think it was ever something that I consciously did. It's just natural depending on who I'm talking to. The way I talk and the languages I use automatically changes. When I'm speaking Taglish, which is Tagalog and English, for example, my English accent changes as well. But living in Manila as a kid and then going back to Manila as an adult after having lived in the West for so long, that's a different story. I think this is where the real code switching happens. Aside from modifying, you know, the language I use. For example, in Manila, when I was there, I helped out with my family's business. And even now when I go back, I sometimes, you know, help out my mom if she has any tasks that she needs help with. So for example, when I'd go with my parents to a business meeting, you know, I had to adjust a little bit. So I tend to be very direct and I tend to just kind of get down to business and not waste any time. Of course, in the West, we also do a little bit of small talk before getting down to business, but that portion lasts a short time, you know, and then you have to get on to doing what you need to do. In the Philippines, it's kind of the opposite. You have to socialize. So the small talk portion could last longer than the actual business portion. So the socialization could last like 45 minutes and then the business part could last like 15 minutes. And that's exactly what happened when I went with my mom to the bank, for example. But of course, if it's a local bank, then they do things like the locals would do. But if it was more of a multinational bank, like say HSBC or something, they might do things a little differently as well. And around Chinese people, I don't think I adjust my behavior that much aside from, you know, the language I use, because I also grew up very Chinese at home and at school. So even when I'm around people from China, Taiwan, or Hong Kong, for example, I feel like I'm pretty familiar with Chinese etiquette. And also because of my accent, when I speak Chinese, they know that I grew up abroad. So they don't really judge you if you don't get something or you don't understand something, at least from my experience. What they would get mad about is if you don't try to speak the language. I think that's what really upsets them because they, you know, they really take pride in the language aspect. So from my experience, as long as I'm making an effort, to speak Mandarin or, my Fujian dialect, then they'd be happy enough. And so in terms of learning to adapt and coming to terms with my identity, throughout all the changes I've experienced, I learned to slightly modify my speech or actions depending on the situation. So of course, there are certain drawbacks to code switching. A Harvard Business Review article called "The Costs of Code Switching" talks about some of the social and psychological repercussions of code switching. In a Western context, downplaying your own racial group can generate hostility from in-group members. For example, you can be accused of acting white, for example, or seeking to downplay stereotypes and feigning commonality with coworkers can also deplete cognitive resources and reduces authentic self-expression. But code switching is not always a bad thing, I don't think. It may simply be a way for people to understand you, or simply a result of immersing yourself in your environment. So there's so many different ways we code switch in daily life. Whether you come from a multi-ethnic or multicultural background or not, I think everybody will act a little differently at home versus at work, with family versus with friends. For me, code switching has become something of an innate skill, almost as natural as breathing. So I still do it now. In fact, when I was preparing for this presentation, I found myself naturally switching to the American spelling of words, even if you guys won't see my notes. And I think what's important to remember is that there's no endpoint necessarily for learning about cultural adaptations. So culture and identity, I think, and dealing with people is not a math equation that you can just solve or master. We're all constantly evolving and learning from each other. And so for the most part, I feel that I don't find that it interferes with my daily well-being. I've since learned to accept that I am different, and I will be a little different depending on the situation I'm in or the people I talk to. It doesn't mean that I'm a different person when I do that, or that I'm compromising something very fundamental about myself. I think it's all a part of me. At first, code switching was a way for me to survive, but now I've embraced it as just a part of my whole being. All of these identities, histories, languages, and cultures, I think all make up myself. And so it's really about learning how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And that concludes my part of the presentation. And we actually have prepared a short video montage for you guys, which is a montage of our guests talking about their own personal experiences growing up in different cultural contexts.
So I was born in Japan, in a small city called Tokushima on Shikoku Island. That's one of the 4 main islands of Japan. I was born there, and then when I was 6 years old, my father got transferred to Washington, D.C. for his job. And so our whole family moved there, and we spent 7 years there, living in suburban D.C. When I was 13, my father was transferred back to Japan. So our whole family moved back to Tokushima again, left all my friends behind and then moved back to a city where I was born, but I didn't know anyone.
I'm half Filipino, half Japanese. So my dad is Filipino and my mom is Japanese. But I would say I grew up both in Japan and in the Philippines. Yeah, I think for me, I was double schooled. So what that meant was I would spend most of my year in the Philippines, like go to school like anyone else. But when it's the summer vacation, the summer holidays in the Philippines, for those months, I would be in Japan, and then I would go to school there. And it just so happened that the time that it's summer break in the Philippines, the new school year starts in Japan. So the timing was also perfect. And so every year during that time, I would go to school in Japan for 2 months.
So in terms of my cross-cultural background, both my parents are from South Korea, but I was actually born in the US while my father was getting his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh. But we moved back to Korea when I was 2, so I really don't remember any of my time in Pittsburgh. But it has always been a part of my background growing up in Korea, knowing that I have a US citizenship, even though I never kind of knew what that really meant, like being an American. And when I was 13, my father told my family that we were moving to Belgium because of his job, which made me at the time very upset because I always thought that I would live in Korea forever. And I didn't even know where Belgium was back then.
So I'm Taiwanese by birth. Then I moved to Canada when I was around 11 years old. And in Canada, that's where I finished most of my education up to bachelor degree. So I did my my bachelor's in chemical engineering in Toronto. And then after that, I moved to France to study in this European fragrance management dual degree. So where the first year is more on the Masters of Science, and I did that in France, in Paris. And the second year we moved to Italy, near Venice, in a small town called Padova.
Whenever people ask me about this question, where I'm originally from and places I have lived, it always takes me 5 minutes to answer this question. Because to me, I always consider myself a global citizen and a third culture kid, and always have the feeling of doesn't belong to anywhere, but at the same time can easily adopt to new cultures, environments, and it's more like a citizen of everywhere and nowhere. So I have been moving to a new country, new continent for every 5 years since age of 12.
So that concludes our presentation. So thank you again so much for listening to our stories. And here's our contact information. If anyone wants to stay connected, we also have a website. I can put it in the chat later. Shall I at this point stop sharing the slides, or shall I just keep this on?
Yeah, we've actually just shared it in the chat, so feel free to close screen sharing, and then maybe we can jump right into the Q&A with you and Phoebe. So first of all, before we really get into the Q&A, I just wanted to thank you both for sharing, some quite personal stories about your background, your not just work history, but like growing up, which I mean everyone kind of has. Growing up isn't easy for a lot of people, and I think and when you add that extra layer of how do I navigate this, like with the different identities I hold, or now I've moved to a whole new country, whole new context that I need to adapt to. I think it's, as someone who also has had that experience, it's just very important to me, I think, to hear yours. And I wanted to really thank you both again for sharing them. So before I start asking a few of the questions that we've received so far, I wanted to just remind everyone to please send your questions as a direct message to Gabe at Q&A submissions, I should say. And he'll pass them along to me to ask to Asuka and Phoebe. And so I guess I want to start off with, I guess maybe we'll zoom out a little bit first, because there was a lot that kind of I found myself nodding a lot throughout both of your presentations. As someone who grew up ethnically, like culturally Filipino, but was born and raised in Canada, there's a lot that I resonate with your sort of history, Phoebe, but also Asuka. I lived in Japan for 4 years, and so I understand like a lot of that work culture, that the structure that's like quite rigid there was also very difficult for me. So yeah, I wanted to sort of zoom out first a little bit and just talk a bit about like, what do you see as the benefits of having these sort of multifaceted cultures? Like what are the sort of benefits to being like that third culture kid that might not be so readily recognizable by someone who's just meeting you, or someone who hasn't really had that experience? And Asuka or Phoebe, either one of you are welcome to answer that question. And feel free to keep yourself unmuted as well, Asuka, if that makes it easier for responding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the question. I'll just open up and say that probably as much as we need to navigate as individuals to find and integrate our roots and new identities, I think along the way, we naturally sort of, with conscious effort as well, but learn how to be interculturally competent individuals and also professionals. And I think what's important is like more than just like the skill of navigating, whether it's language or manners, what have you. I think it's really the empathy that you can kind of develop as a person towards people and, you know, people in the community if you kind of go through the similar challenges navigating across cultures and countries. Yeah, how about you, Phoebe?
Yeah, I think definitely one of the biggest skills I developed was being very flexible and adaptable. So when I was, a kid, I was sort of very afraid of change, but now I kind of embrace it. And I think, that's also a very important skill to have, whether in the workplace or in your personal life. And I do agree with Asuka, being able to empathize with people from all walks of life is also really important.
Yeah, that empathy really is a thing that I think you can tap into it quite easily when you've spent most of your life kind of being in flux like that, like constantly adapting, reshaping yourself to fit different scenarios or cultural environments that you're in. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you both for answering that. And just kind of similar to the idea of like having these multiple cultures. And Phoebe, you mentioned a little bit in yours that there was maybe, or maybe it was Asuka, the idea of culture shock and reverse culture shock, especially when you come back to a culture that you thought you were so used to after however long you were away. And I wanted to ask, like, could you speak a little bit about that reverse culture shock, or being surprised by part of your own culture when you experienced them, either the first time, or like I said, coming back to it after several years? I know that this is a thing that I experienced quite strongly when I returned from Japan, and so I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think for me, one of the biggest things I experienced when I went back to Manila in terms of reverse culture shock, I think I kind of mentioned it in the presentation as well, was the Philippine time. So Philippines tend to be a bit more, relaxed in general. And also you can't totally blame them because the traffic jam is like just really, really bad. And so, yeah, but I would always kind of try my best to be on time. And I'd actually, I don't like being late either. So, I kind of get a little stressed out when I feel that I'm going to be late. But when I get to the destination, people would be like 30 minutes late. And it's not really, it's not even really a big deal. But if it's someone maybe new to the country who experiences that, I would understand that they might feel stressed out. They might feel that the person stood them up or something, but they didn't stand you up. It's just kind of the way that it is. And so I think that was one of the biggest things for me.
Yeah, Filipino time is always 30 minutes later than you actually think a thing is going to happen. Yeah, Asuka, did you want to address that question as well?
Sure, yeah. I guess for me, I was in Japan until I was 16. So, and I did kind of come back and forth for like summer vacation, things like that. But again, it's a totally different thing when you are back to live as an adult. And yeah, for example, I really appreciated the convenience in Tokyo. For example, in Canada, I had to wait for the bus, or I didn't have a car, so I felt a lot more independent in terms of mobility back in Tokyo. And again, as some of you may know, the train system in Japan is hyper accurate. Yeah, but then there were also like small things that kind of like stressed me out. For example, like not having a dryer. So you always had to do your laundry on a weekend on a sunny day so you can dry your clothes outside. And I guess the other thing is that come to mind is that so these cross-cultural like struggles, I first actually didn't know, I think it was a reverse culture shock. And even though I may, talk about some of the things with my family, and some of them did, live abroad, but not to the extent that I had. So I think sometimes even with your family, some of these things may be hard to communicate. Yeah, so I think that's why I think it's very important to, build your own network of people, whether friends or mentors, along with your family, who you can, feel open to and trust to talk about these things. So yeah, those are the things that come into mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's such a great point. Just also speaking from my own experience, like being able to talk about this, an experience that you had is so important, and sometimes, you can do that with your family. Like there are certain aspects of like that cultural identity that you can share with them. But like in your case, Asuka, and for my own as well, when I went to Japan and came back and I wanted to talk about all these things I was experiencing and trying to readjust to like life back in Canada, where I was born and raised, like I said, they didn't understand it. And it was really, it was a real struggle to find people that could understand what it was I was feeling, why I was feeling it, because even though, my parents had some of that experience being immigrants from the Philippines, it wasn't quite the same. Like each of us are our own individuals for one thing, but, they hadn't lived 4 years teaching and working in Japan, and I had, and there was, I think a lot of value, like you said, to having that community, the people with shared experiences that you can fall back on and connect with. And just because I wanted to mention it, it's a fun thing that the three of us discovered when we were initially talking about this webinar. My hometown is where Asuka did her exchange program, I think, in Canada for high school. She lived probably within like a 5-minute drive of where I lived, I think, in Port Coquitlam.
Yeah,
And,
so yeah, you mentioned that. I was actually there for like high school, and also Phoebe lived in the same community. So yeah, please go ahead, Samantha. Yeah, it was such a serendipity.
yeah, no, and it's just funny because I lived there basically my whole life. I think I lived for a short time in North Vancouver and then Burnaby, but most of my life I lived in Port Coquitlam. And it's just, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a very small, not small, I guess, but it's a suburb further east out of Vancouver. So not exactly a place where we all expected to have that like in common. But yeah, thank you both for sharing those experiences. I know reverse culture shock can be surprising and you can encounter in kind of ways you don't expect. Kind of shifting maybe the conversation a little bit, we had a question where they want the audience wanted to know what you think the difference is between transnational and domestic migration in terms of how that changes your identity or how that builds your identity. Yeah, so if either of you have something you'd like to share just about that nuance, maybe.
So the difference between transnational migration and domestic migration?
Yeah, so let's say within, like moving with it, like from the East Coast to the West Coast is obviously like a very different culture in Canada as well as in the US. But then, yeah, between nations, of course, is what a lot of people first think of when they think that, oh, you're moving into a different culture. But it can also happen even within the same country. And so I guess what do you think the differences are there in terms of how a person can then build their identity or understand themselves?
Please feel free to chime in, both Phoebe and Samantha, because you're also very versed in this experience as well. First, I would think definitely there are commonalities, whether you're moving within the country, because as you mentioned, there's a diversity of cultures within the same country. But I think the main difference is in terms of your identity, like nationality-wise. You know, if you are moving in the same country, you probably won't go through the confusions or any kind of challenges towards who you are as a person of, you know, a certain country, perhaps. But what's unique about transnational and transnational meaning, yes, you're moving across different countries as you live. And so that can really change the language, currency, living environment, food, people, like all the changes I think you need to navigate are a lot bigger in scope and probably most deepest in the sense of your belonging. And so, yeah, I'll just pause there, but I think it's just a different sort of, maybe it's not depth because any change can be, you know, a deep kind of change, but yeah, just in terms of your sense of belonging in a certain country, yeah, it can be very different.
Yeah, I agree, because if you move within a country, you know, to a certain extent, there's still, even if it's, you know, from the West Coast to the East Coast, in a sense, there's still kind of that national identity that you can kind of fall back on. So of course it's different, but then, yeah, in terms of maybe culture, maybe compared to a transnational move, it's not as big of a shock, at least for me. That's what I found. And also just in terms of logistics, for example, the more practical aspects of it, if you move within a country, you know, it's easier because you don't have to worry about, you know, passport. Of course, you'll probably want to bring your passport, but in terms of, you know, visa applications and all of that, you don't have to. And also there's this sense of, even if you move to a different place within a country, you can always like go back to the place that you left. And maybe if you still have your family home, which is, you know, in my case, you know, I still have stuff there. And if I ever want it in the future, I can just go back and take it. Where if it's a transnational move, it's just harder to just simply go back and, you know, take your stuff and all of that. So logistically, it's also a bit more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think speaking as someone who also like moved across, like I lived for a while in New England and then moved out to the West Coast again, which felt a lot more comfortable, even like though I'm in the US versus Canada. I can see what you mean though about there's still this sense of like, well, I'm already part of this country. I already have this national identity. And even if there are some more, you know, dialect or maybe slight differences in cuisine, like especially like if, let's say, coming from the South to the West Coast or something, like that's quite a different way in engaging with people and the kinds of food and things that you're exposed to. But the scope, like you were saying, Asuka, is just, I think, much larger. There's much more hurdles to sort of overcome when you're looking at a transnational move. And I think that in terms of how it might play out in identity is maybe has like it takes a little bit more longer for some in some cases perhaps to make that adjustment or to find your place in all of that. And I guess speaking of like transnational moves and maybe looking at the relationships that you have with families, with like, let's say if you moved with your parents, or if you are a third culture kid and you're trying to like connect with your parents over this new cultural identity, like, and maybe a cultural identity that the parents may not share. I was wondering, or one of the questions we had was asking if you have any advice for, you know, children who don't have certain cultural aspects that they can share with their parents and how to communicate that with them.
Yeah,
Right.
so
Please go ahead.
ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that since I'm not an expert on parenting, because I myself is not a parent, and so there's just a disclaimer that sorry, like if I can't be of any technical help here, but I think really having a listening ear to what your child might want to say it can really go a long way, rather than kind of maybe imposing like an identity on your child. For example, like you were born in Japan, so you must be Japanese, right? Or like, no, you should use this language more, or like, you know, there may be different educational needs and wants in the family, what have you. But I think, first of all, trying to understand your child as a person, and yeah, just kind of listening to, you know, what he, she, they may have to say, and trying to, you know, understand that. I think that listening ear can maybe be the first step.
So Phoebe, what were you going to say?
Yeah, since I also was going to say that I can't really answer to this question, but we did do an episode in season 1 with Dr. Jo, and she talked a little bit about this topic, and I think she was speaking more from a Korean American perspective. And what she mentioned was that, you know, sometimes parents see their kids as an extension of themselves, so it can be hard for them to hear from their kid that they're having a hard time. So that's why they may not be open to hearing these discussions. So what could work was, you know, kind of getting your parents comfortable as well. So maybe you can be watching a movie, you know, and then if the topic from the movie kind of relates to what you want to talk about and it's a difficult topic, then, you know, maybe you can kind of slowly bring it up. And then that's how you can kind of, you know, gradually get them to open up to you as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So that was Dr. Josephine Kim, who's a cross-cultural licensed counselor and also professor at HGSE. And so, yeah, I would really encourage you to listen to her episode. And that also, you know, is in relation to mostly East Asian culture as well. So, you know, those cultural values can also impact how you communicate with your child. Yeah, and so if it's especially a stressful or hard topic, yeah, maybe starting some kind of point to open up a conversation, you know, maybe starting from there. Yeah, and I think I remember for my part, I remember when I was a teenager, I think my father told me that if you ever get confused about who you are, like whether you're Japanese or whether you're Canadian, you know, which am I more of, just think you're Asuka, you know, period. And that kind of helped me in a way, as blunt as it may be. I was like, okay, just kind of like going back to what Phoebe said, embracing yourself as who you are. But again, I think I'm glad that I actually went on further to explore what that actually means. So yeah, I think, yeah, just having that kind of, you know, open communication would be helpful.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's something that, I mean, I personally can relate to as well. Just knowing, I mean, when I came back from Japan, and like, even though I'd been sort of raised Filipino, I didn't really speak Tagalog. I didn't, other than kind of like growing up in a Filipino household and eating food and having like that access to those sort of cultural elements, that identity didn't really become so strong until I had come back from Japan and had a better understanding first of like what it was like for me living in Japan as a non-Japanese Asian woman, but then also understanding better how my parents had to adapt when they immigrated from the Philippines to Canada. And of course, it still was a different thing, especially I think for my grandparents, it was a little bit more of a difficult thing for me to be going and having this sort of Japanese identity that in some ways I held when, you know, for them, they're just remembering like, oh, well, when I was a child, like they occupied us. And it's like, that's a real, an extreme example, I think, of how there could be difficulties and like in terms of trying to bridge that conversation. But also it's kind of an opportunity for, you know, empathy again, for opening up not just ourselves, but like giving the opportunity for others to kind of imagine a different way of thinking, a different way of living your life. Because I think when you only have that one identity, it can be a challenge to imagine yourself outside of it.
Yeah, and just sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I think in addition to like intercultural competency thing, yeah, I think it's really important to learn the history of each other, like you said about the atrocities that Japan has done to other countries. So really like knowing the history of your country and others as you move around the world, because different people have different perceptions and histories. And so yeah, my hope is that there can be still, you know, points of connection, but definitely acknowledging that past is really important, I think, too. So yeah.
Yeah. And I know we've gone a little bit over time here, but there was one more question that I really wanted to get to, since Phoebe, you had dedicated much of your presentation to talk about how you do code switching. And I know I do it for myself. And you kind of ended off saying, you know, it may, you know, seem like a betrayal in some ways, but it's also a survival tool, or it's also just part of your identity. And so I was wondering if both you or Asuka could answer this. What would you say to people who, you know, call you out, as it were, or who say that, you know, code switching is disingenuous or untrue to your, you know, to part of your identity? Is there anything you'd like to say to them, or that you would hope that they could understand from your own perspective?
I would say that it's all a part of me, actually, because, you know, I can't just simply turn off like certain parts of you know, experiences that I grew up with either. I can't just simply turn off like one aspect of myself. So I think, you know, one of the things being a third culture kid is it's this sense of belonging everywhere, but nowhere at the same time. And I think that also relates to identity. You could be everything and nothing at the same time. So I think for me, maybe what's a good way to think about is, I don't know, to honor, I think, every aspect of your identity. And you know, it's just a part of you, I think. That's how I would answer that question.
I think that was beautifully summarized. So like I'll try to think how else, but yes, for me, I think probably the first time that I came across the conflict in my identity in terms of code switching is when I was back in Japan, and when I was trying to talk in Japanese, even though I used Japanese with my families or other friends in Canada. I even took like a journalism class in Japanese, but I think when it comes to casual conversation, I was so used to speaking polite Japanese and being detached from pop culture for so long. It was very hard for me to strike the right tone, I guess. It was very hard, I guess, thinking back, for me to express myself authentically in ways I wanted. So maybe that created, you know, some kind of, you know, shield or what have you, or like, you know, people might have not understood me as a person well, perhaps, but over time, I think, I guess, as living and by doing, you learn the right sort of tone or the, language that you want to strike. And yeah, it was kind of like a really for me to hear what Phoebe said about, embracing that as part of who you are. So even though in the beginning it may seem a little glitchy or like not very smooth, as you kind of embed that in your daily communication, it's not that we're trying to be fake or anything, but I think it's really like a way we kind of developed to navigate different social spaces. And yeah, so now I think I guess I can kind of look at it in a more natural light. So yeah, but definitely being able to be authentic is really key.
Yeah, I think sometimes it could be age too, because when you're younger, you're a lot less grounded and unsure of yourself. But as you grow older and you get to know yourself a little bit more, then you start just being more comfortable just in general. So, I think maturity plays a part in that as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I just really want to echo what you were saying, Asuka, about authenticity, and authentic to you, not authentic to whatever other kind of expectation other people have outside of you, I think is sort of the key when it comes to code switching, because I guess I could see how there might be situations where am I code switching for my own sake, or because this is who I am, or am I code switching to make someone else comfortable because I'm afraid of, what they might think of me if I accidentally say or do something that they're not expecting. And I think when you kind of approach it with the idea that this is who I am, and I'm not doing it out of this sort of, it's not this thought process that I have to do to make sure, it's no longer just I need to protect myself, and so let me make sure I'm making other people happy. It's living truly in like your authenticity and living truly to your identities, kind of like what you were saying in your presentation, Phoebe, that it doesn't happen in like this sort of calculation that you have. It just happens because that's who you are. And I think that's really wonderful, and such a great note, I think, to leave this Q&A session on. Which unfortunately we should, because I know we are a bit over time. And I really just wanted to thank both of you, Asuka and Phoebe, for your insight today. And, for after, when we pause the recording, it'll be wonderful to continue this conversation with anyone who'd like to stay. And so I just wanted to invite just a warm round of applause to both of you for your time this afternoon. So happy to have you here. And maybe at this point, I'll switch things over to the door prize raffle drawing. And so Gabe, I guess, and Kasha from Ikigai Connections is here with 5 free passes, I guess, for some of her online resources for job searching and networking and things like that. So perhaps I'll pass this over to Kasha now. Kasha, welcome again.
Wow. I mean, what a very important conversation that was just had. I was really, really interested. And I also can relate in a different way because I was born in America to Polish parents. So I grew up speaking Polish and I started learning English in kindergarten. And then I started to get interested in Japan. I eventually lived in Japan for 8 years, Poland for 2, Italy for 1, and then came back home to Michigan. And throughout that entire experience, I realized that, when I'm in America, I don't feel American. I feel almost like not fully within the culture. And then when I was in Poland, even though I'm of Polish descent and I could speak Polish, I always was very like, oh, am I speaking this with a strange accent? And am I not using the grammar the correct way? And then in Japan, I obviously don't look Japanese, but I felt such a kinship with Japan. So it's interesting how you feel with all these different cultures that you learn. But I like to think of it in a way that we're all ambassadors in a sense. We are all we're aware of the differences and the similarities between cultures. And if we can help share that knowledge with other people who aren't privileged to travel or to experience that, I think that that's one thing that we can all do in our own ways to just make the world a better place by sharing how really alike we are, and we can learn from all the amazingness that we can share. So that's just a little bit. I was really like, wow, I love this conversation. So very excited to be here. And I represent Ikigai Connections. I'm the founder. So I basically help people who want to use Japanese language and or cultural skills in their career. So I have a job board where I focus on anybody who wants to find a Japanese related job in the United States, but I also talk about how to find a Japanese job in any country, even in Japan. And Asuka-san, you mentioned some very important points about working in Japan. In certain cultures, it's extremely difficult to understand and relate to coming from the outside, or probably even being, on the inside and being very difficult for your mental health. So I often tell people that, a lot of people have this dream of working in Japan, but I say, there's pluses and minuses to so much. So go do your research, talk to people, see what the industry is like, see what the companies are like. It can be very, very different and wide ranging. So I do often say that, and I think it's extremely wise information. So today I really wanted to share, if anybody's interested, I'm just going to share my screen for a quick second. I have a set of, I have 5 training programs that I've created. They're all online. And I talk about, it's related to Japanese jobs. But even if you're here and you're not really using anything with Japanese, I think it could still apply to any culture or any particular topic that you're interested in. So I split them into 5 different topics. The first one is about your career ikigai and what ikigai means. For anybody who doesn't know, it's kind of what you really want to do, like your passion. So if you're trying to figure out what kind of a job you want, this is good, and this is free for everybody forever. So you want to just check it out. You can use this QR code, take a picture, and you'll be directed to all the content and even introductory videos for all these courses. I also go into Japanese and English resumes. I talk about networking, and that one isn't necessarily specific to, I talk about Japan as well, but if you're not really into the Japanese thing, you can still use this for so many other things too. Then I talk about the job search in general, like how to actually do the searching, how to find the job ads, how to reach out. And the last one is Japanese Jobs 105, where I talk about applying for the jobs and interviewing, some tips that you can learn about that. And I'm very happy to share these with everybody. If you'd like, you can go ahead and snap that QR code just to see what they look like. Like I said, the first one is free to everybody, but today, if there are 5 winners who are interested, I'd be happy to share any one of these other 4 courses with you for free.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Kasha. And for those of you who don't know, Kasha was our special guest at last month's webinar. So we're super excited to have you back here and to have you here as, the prize.
Yes,
so
yes.
Very, very excited. And so Gabe, are we ready then to start the door prize drawing?
Yes, we have. Yes, we are ready, and yeah, looking forward to getting our 5 lucky winners. So let's find them right now. But before I do that real fast, I also just wanted to express my gratitude to the speakers, and also to Kasha and Samantha for sharing their insight as well. Super impressive presentation, and also shout out to Asuka's dad for having such stellar parenting skills too. I thought that was a really, really nice quote from him. But anyway, let's find our 5 lucky winners. I'm going to pull some random numbers here to try to find who's going to get access to those courses. So winner number 1 is going to be number 5, and that's going to be Johan Chin. Johan Chin, if you're here, please feel free to unmute and let us know that you're here. You have to be present to receive the prize.
I'm here.
Hey, congratulations.
Hi, Johan.
Kasha.
Hello. Yeah,
all right.
Congratulations.
So we will be in touch with everybody who is selected as a winner. So watch your email. We'll get in touch with you soon. So congratulations, Johan. Hope I'm saying your name right. Our next one, number 45, Elaine Mew. Elaine Mew, are you here?
I think I see them in the participant list. Feel free to unmute yourself or throw up a quick hello in the chat if you're still there. Elaine?
Are you there, Elaine? I can see you, but you got to let us know that you're here. Going once, going twice. I think
they're still here if we want.
Tell you what, we'll give it to you. We'll give it to you, Elaine, because you're actually here. Maybe you just can't unmute at the moment or something like that. So we'll add you to the list. We'll get in touch. Please watch for that email. And our next one is going to be number 22, which is Jade Tan. Jade Tan, are you still around?
Jade, I don't see Jade. We might have left earlier. Yeah.
Not seeing the name.
No.
Sorry, Jade. So the next one is going to be number 8, Anthony Chadwick. Anthony Chadwick, are you here?
See Anthony.
Here.
Hey.
Great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Anthony. We'll be in touch. All right. And then our next one, number 37. So Orly Kleiner, are you here? I see you. I hear a cat.
Yeah. I don't think that was Orly. I think that's just my cat.
Orly, are you here? It's like we're doing a seance. If you're here, please give us a sign. Bang twice.
Well, I see them in the participant list, so let's give it to them.
Okay, we'll go ahead and add Orly to the list as well. And then that'll just bring us to one final one. Got a number. Okay, it's going to be number 41, which is Karen Juarez. Karen Juarez.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I have a friend that I think might be especially interested who's traveled to Japan quite a bit. She's a nurse.
Oh, perfect.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'll share with her if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free. Wonderful. So those are our 5 winners. We'll be in touch with the 5 of you.
Thank you.
So watch your emails for that. Thank you once again to Kasia and Ikigai Connections for sponsoring us this month and for joining us last month as well. It was another very good presentation. Anybody that's interested in hearing more from Kasia, please, of course, check the website, check the QR code right there, but also on our YouTube page, Laurasian Institution Presents, you can watch the full video of last month's presentation. I think there's a lot of really good, interesting information in there for people looking for jobs related to Japan.
Yeah, well, yeah, great. Well, congratulations again to our winners. Thank you again to Kasia and Ikigai Connections. And I think this is going to be it then for us for the recorded portion of the webinar. Once again, just wanted to bring Phoebe and Asuka back for another thank you, another warm round of applause for all of your participation and wonderful insights today. I couldn't thank you enough. It was such a pleasure to have this discussion with you. And for anyone else who is interested in sticking around, we will be ending the recording shortly, and you're free to kind of unmute yourselves, turn on your video, and we can have just more of a casual conversation away from the cameras and the eyes of the press or whatever. Once again, this is we're Laurasian Institution. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have other event ideas or if you'd like to join us for a future event. I think the next one for June will be a networking event. So more information about that will be released in the coming weeks. And so please check us out and let's keep up this connection and this dialogue. Thank you all for your time today, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Samantha and Gabe and Kasia too for all the facilitation and everything. So thank you to Laurasian Institution.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks for everyone for joining us. The recording will stop in just a moment, and then, yeah, we can start our casual chat. But thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.